Welcome to Evidence-Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we're talking about obsessive-compulsive disorder. We're joined by Jon Hershfield, director of the Center for OCD and Anxiety at Sheppard Pratt in Towson, Maryland. He specializes in the use of mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy for obsessive-compulsive disorder and related disorders. He is the author of Overcoming Harm OCD, When a Family Member Has OCD, and the OCD Workbook for Teens. He is also the co-author of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD and Everyday Mindfulness for OCD. Hi, Jon. Welcome to Evidence-Based. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jon. So we wanted to start off talking about, I feel like OCD is really commonly thrown around, maybe one of the most commonly thrown around terms, like for being clean. I'm so OCD, you hear that a lot. Can you talk about what OCD is and what it isn't?
Yeah, and that's a great question to start us off. So obsessive-compulsive disorder is a psychiatric condition. The diagnosis is in the name, which is one of the advantages to it. So it's made up of obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are unwanted intrusive thoughts, images, and urges. And compulsions are these mental or physical behaviors that people engage in to try to reduce distress around these unwanted thoughts. And typically the way that they are designed to reduce distress is by varying attempts to increase certainty that these unwanted thoughts, images, and urges won't come true. And then you have this word disorder, which really just means out of order, right? So we all have unwanted intrusive thoughts. That's part of the human condition. We all have various rituals and things that we do to kind of keep things simple so we don't have to think about everything every time. But when obsessions and compulsions create a kind of cycle or looping effect that keeps people stuck and starts to impair their functioning, starts to take up more and more of their time, get between them and their ability to behave according to their values, access the things they really want in life and their potential, well, then we start to call it a disorder. So it's a little bit different from like a disease or a defect or some sort of awful thing in the sense of like, people aren't defective merchandise. It's a treatable condition where if you understand how it works, you can understand how to sort of recondition yourself to be less burdened by intrusive thoughts and the compulsions that are associated with them.
Could you give us some examples of the ways that OCD commonly manifests in a person or what you see that as?
Yeah, well, the ones people who are listening to this podcast might be most familiar with are the things that you see sometimes portrayed on television and in film with varying degrees of success and sensitivity. Contamination, so people being concerned about disgust or potentially getting sick from touching things that they think are dirty, germs, bodily fluids, chemicals, things like that, or worrying that they're going to get these things on them and then spread it to other people. Another common way OCD manifests is hyper-responsibility. So just excessive concern that you alone are responsible for making sure that things have been properly turned off so they don't cause a fire, or properly locked so that you're not responsible for, having things stolen or something like that. And then other ones that are actually quite common, but you don't see talked about as much, would be thoughts in the realm of intrusive, unacceptable thoughts. So these are what we call ego-dystonic thoughts, meaning they don't line up with your identity. It's sort of like the junk mail of the mind. You think, well, why am I thinking this? It doesn't make any sense. But it's showing up in your inbox, so it seems very important. And this could be thoughts about sexual themes or violent themes or thoughts that go against your religious beliefs or your moral beliefs. And as you can imagine, they can be quite upsetting, and people will do all kinds of things to try to make themselves certain that these things won't come true or that they're not bad people. But pretty much if you can think it, you can turn it into an obsession, because it's that quality of moral urgency to be certainty about it that really makes it an obsession.
Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up in your work with clients, have you seen an uptick of people presenting with OCD symptoms, post-pandemic, sort of with everything going on in the world?
I think there's been an uptick with mental health issues, and OCD is such a common mental health issue that, of course, we're seeing an uptick in that as well, and anxiety in general. So OCD isn't technically characterized as an anxiety disorder anymore in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's sort of its own category, but we know it has a lot in common with the anxiety disorders. It's just that with OCD, it could be driven by other discomforts, other forms of distress like disgust. But things like generalized anxiety, specific phobias, panic disorder, body dysmorphic disorder. All these things are sort of characterized by difficulty dealing with unwanted intrusive thoughts and ineffective strategies for coping. So we're living in a world now where we're more isolated, we're spending more time alone, we're spending more time thinking about our problems and what's wrong with us. It doesn't take very long to turn on TV and see any, or go on the internet and see any kind of media that's reflecting back to us everything that's wrong with us, everything that's wrong with the world all the time. So we're kind of living in a very difficult mental health situation. So certainly, the supply and demand problem is real. I mean, there's only so many therapists, and the good thing is more and more people are thinking that it's okay to ask for help, and that they should ask for help if they, and there might be professional help. So in one sense, that's an improvement. I see more people with OCD spending less time suffering before they actually try to get treatment, but there isn't always enough treatment out there. And then of course there are more people suffering. I wouldn't blame the pandemic on making OCD worse. I think it's just sort of raised the bar for everything, and OCD goes along with that.
Sure, sure. And what are some common co-occurring conditions that happen with OCD that you see?
Yeah, well, earlier I mentioned some of the ones that are like OCD, generalized anxiety and social anxiety disorder and panic disorder and things like that. But then it's also very common for people with OCD to struggle with co-occurring substance use issues, major depressive disorder, a variety of personality disorders like borderline personality disorder. It sounds scary when I say it out loud, but it's just the nature of things. If you have one mental health condition, it's just more likely that you might have another one. And then these conditions will play off of each other, right? So the struggling with OCD might cause you to isolate more socially, which might give you social anxiety the next time you're, meant to go do something around people, or might interfere in your relationships, which might trigger more of your difficulties with attachment. And if you have borderline personality, for example. So I think it's very important when you do seek professional help that you get a comprehensive evaluation, and that you don't throw everything in the box of, oh, well, everything is OCD or everything is depression. People are complicated, and if you understand those complications, you really stand a better chance of helping them if you can see how different mental health conditions are playing off each other.
And also, kind of a follow up to that. So, what are some of the common OCD triggers that you're looking for in practice, or that triggers and symptoms, like just things that you're looking for in someone who might be diagnosed OCD?
Well, mostly people will, once they know that they're in a safe space, I'm very fortunate, they'll sort of either gradually open up to me, or sometimes people will just let it out the gate once they realize like, okay, the OCD is real, OCD is a thing. Okay, well, let me tell you about all my OCD problems. So I usually ask people to just kind of walk me through what their day looks like, and what's making them go off baseline, right? So the experience is mostly you're minding your own business, everything is fine, and then suddenly you realize there's a serious problem, right? You're very upset, you're very anxious, you have to fix something. And so when we talk about a trigger, we're talking about some sort of stimulus that has made you shift your attention into problem solving mode. And so that could be something external, like maybe you realized that you touched something that wasn't clean, or maybe somebody said something on a TV show that triggered a thought, or you saw something in a movie that triggered an unwanted thought. Or it could be something internal. Maybe you noticed a physical symptom, like a pain in your body, and you started worrying that you had a disease. Or you might have noticed, like I said before, an obsession is a unwanted thought, image, or urge. And we often kind of forget to talk about the urge part of things because it's so uncomfortable. But what that means is a bodily sensation that feels like you could do something. So it's not the same thing as an impulse where the likelihood of you acting out is higher, like, you have an impulse to yell at someone or throw something. It's more of like you feel like if you have an intrusive thought about turning your car into oncoming traffic, you might then have the sensation in your hand like you meant to turn the steering wheel, even though your hand didn't move. So these are the types of things that people describe for me that are upsetting them, which is, again, they're sort of reading this spam junk mail that's coming into their feed marked as urgent, and they don't know, are they supposed to ignore it? It looks like spam. Or are they supposed to open it and reply to it and take it very seriously, which then teaches the algorithm to send you more of that stuff. So a lot of the work I do is helping people learn how to relate to their thoughts differently so they can tell the difference between signal, which is kind of a prompt to address a solvable problem, or noise, which is just, the sound of the machinery in your head.
I really love the metaphor of the mail, the inbox. I think that makes it really easy to understand and parse out, some of these bigger thoughts about what OCD might be. It's like, okay, you know what junk mail is, like you can relate that. And in your work, you talk about the OCD mind and its parts. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's different from the average mind?
So in the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD, this whole concept of the mind functioning like a spotlight came up in a discussion with a client where they said, "Well, am I just noticing more of this stuff? Like, why am I thinking this way?" I mean, a lot of my clients will ask me, "Is like, what's wrong with me? Why am I noticing these thoughts? Other people don't seem to be noticing these thoughts." And we know from the research that other people are having these thoughts. So we're supposed to have unwanted thoughts, and we have like all kinds of goofy, weird, taboo thoughts, and it's just part of the human condition. There's nothing wrong with that. But people with OCD seem really struck by them, upset by them, and seem to just notice them. They're sort of popping up in the forefront of the mind instead of on the side. So a metaphor I like to use is this idea of the spotlight, where you think about the mind as that which you look through to collect information from the brain, and it kind of shines down on your brain. If you think of your brain as being something along like a library full of information, it's shining down on that bookshelf. And the average mind is highlighting all the regular stuff, the encyclopedias, the stuff that's not particularly controversial, and a little bit of the stuff that we like to think about, and a little bit of the stuff that we don't like to think about, what I call desirable or undesirable thoughts. And they're all within the realm of like, yeah, everybody thinks that way. But if you widen the spotlight, which is the experience of a person with OCD, it's also shining a bright light on these kind of fringe thoughts that are both on the positive and the negative. So on the upside, you'll meet people with OCD who are very funny, very quick on their feet, very bright. They fall in love very passionately, very intensely, because they're noticing these little details that other people aren't noticing, and they're being pulled in by them. So that's a pretty cool quality. But there's also this burden on the other side of the spotlight, which is these fringe, catastrophic, disturbing, upsetting, often disgusting, viscerally opposed to their morals and their ethics kinds of thoughts are having a bright light shine on them, as much as a bright light it would be shining on, today being Tuesday or it being the end of summer, right? So they're sort of misperceiving the brightness or loudness of the thought with its importance. And that's a big part of the treatment, is learning to kind of step back and not confuse the intensity of your reception of the thought with the actual importance of the content of the thought.
So as we're talking about kind of shining the spotlight on those thoughts, and you had mentioned when you get people into your practice, sometimes they feel like it's a safe space and they'll just kind of unload all of the things that they've been keeping to themselves. So I wanted to talk about why OCD can be isolating. Can you talk a little bit about why that would be such like a personal experience for someone going through that?
I think a lot of people with OCD, first of all, until they've already been in therapy, are under the assumption that there's something wrong with them for having unwanted thoughts in the first place, right? Like, I'm not supposed to have unwanted thoughts. I don't know where this idea comes from. Actually, when you think about it, like, why wouldn't one of the things that the brain does, why wouldn't that be generating unwanted thoughts? It seems like that could have some kind of utility. I don't know what, but some kind of utility. But most people are kind of coming at it from this perspective of something is wrong with me. So there's a lot of shame. And then, of course, there's a lot of self-stigma and external stigma about mental health on both fronts. Cassie, you were asking me before about, people saying so OCD. So like one problem is people calling everything OCD, which, really cheapens the meaning of a psychiatric condition and the pain that someone with that condition goes through. And then on the other side, the stigma of like nobody wanting to admit that they have OCD because they don't want to associate themselves with having a real, quote unquote mental health problem, because maybe they have some beliefs about what that means. It's perfectly okay to have physical health problem, but mental health problems, seem to upset people in certain ways. So there's the stigma coming from within, coming from without, and then there's the very nature of the OCD, particularly when the thoughts are in the realm of taboo, unacceptable, violent, sexual, or religious thoughts that, internally are shameful, right? They don't want to be thought of as weird. They're embarrassed that they had the thoughts. Part of what's upsetting to them in the first place is that they think the having of the thought is in and of itself a kind of bad act. They don't want to admit that it happened. right? And to me, as the OCD therapist, I'm like, whatever, thoughts are thoughts. People tell me everything. It's very hard to impress me at this stage, where someone can tell me like they've had this thought, and I'm like, oh wow, I've never heard that one before. It's usually like, oh, that one, yeah, that gets us. But nobody would know that coming in. So, uh, so it can be very isolating, and that is really unfortunate because it leads some people to really put off getting help. And in that period of time where they're not getting professional help, they're not really thinking of themselves as having OCD. They're thinking of themselves as just being broken people. And that's leading them to do more and more of these ruminations and rituals and avoidances and other compulsions that are strengthening the OCD. So it can become a bit of a downward spiral. And very often I find that people, especially at higher levels of care, are getting the OCD treatment they need only after the OCD has pushed them into a serious depression or substance use problem. Right? They could have come in before, but the stigma and the self-shaming and things like that, kept them from taking ownership of what would otherwise have been a very treatable situation. It's always treatable, but once you get into the higher levels of care, things get more complex, obviously, and then the work is different.
It's no wonder one of our best performing blog posts is your post on harm OCD. And I think people are seeking those others who are having those, more intense thoughts that are more than just like a quick thought. They're like harm, sexual, religious, like what you said. And it's just, I hope more people talk about their experience so that maybe people will seek help sooner because they won't feel so alone. So hopefully we have a long way to go still of destigmatizing, but it feels hopeful that people are looking for that community with this topic.
Yeah, and I think a breakdown in the stigma will also help clinicians be better trained, because one of the reasons that there's so much stigma is also that you don't know for sure that if you go see a therapist that they're going to understand what you're talking about, and they might have preconceived notions about, oh, this person has violent thoughts or sexual thoughts, and we need to dig into that, and that can be very harmful. So as we make improvement with the stigma, including the self-stigma, hopefully more clinicians will be trained to ask questions and that really kind of get at the root of like, where is this, what are these thoughts, these unwanted ego dystonic thoughts that you're having, and like, okay, so that's OCD, right? So some people, their hands are contaminated, and other people feel like their morality is contaminated, and some people wash their hands and other people wash their minds. It's really all the same stuff.
Yeah. It could be anything. And in your book, you talk about just right OCD. Can you talk about what that means?
So I think I should first say that, it's a book, so it has chapters. So in chapters, we divide it into these categories, and those aren't really different kinds of OCD so much as they're just different dimensions or different ways that OCD shows up. And so in just right OCD, the problem seems to be either feeling like something is off or incomplete and needs to be fixed, because if it's not fixed or completed or even or symmetrical or just right, it's going to make me feel uncomfortable for the rest of the day. It's going to be like an itch that hasn't been scratched, and I can't tolerate that feeling. And in that realm, it shares a lot with some other conditions, like autism spectrum or Tourette's or other things, where it's just this sense of like something is off and I need to fix it, and I need to fix it because it is off. And then there's the other sort of presentation of just right. It has more of a magical or superstitious quality to it. I need to line this up or fix it or make it symmetrical, because if I don't, it might somehow in some way cause some unwanted catastrophic thing to happen. My mom is going to get sick if I don't fix this picture frame. And I know it doesn't make any sense to you, and it doesn't make any sense to me, but it still feels like if my mom gets sick and I know I didn't fix this picture frame, it's going to be because I didn't fix the picture frame, and I'm not willing to tolerate that level of guilt.
That is very interesting, the correlation there. And I appreciate you summing up just right OCD, because Cassie and I kind of talked about it before the interview, and I was really interested to hear how you would kind of parse that out as another dimension of OCD. And I want to go back to something that we mentioned in the beginning, which was how OCD is portrayed in the media industry. Like, we see it, like you said, it can be from movies to memes to things like that. And I was just wondering if you thought, or in your opinion, if you think that the portrayal of OCD generally has been minimizing the disorder or wrongly portraying it, or have you seen anything that has given it value, that has like really showed it in the light that you thought was truthful or accurate?
I mean, I don't know how objective I can be. I'm very much immersed in this world, so I'm going to have a much more critical eye on it than the average person. I think even bad portrayals can still have a lot of positive impact on people. and make them feel seen. But they can also cause a lot of harm. So it's difficult to say. I mean, my overall impression is that Hollywood has done a pretty bad job of portraying OCD, and a lot of what they call OCD tends to actually either just be people being quirky, which is fine, but is not the same thing as having a psychiatric condition that's can be debilitating, or people having obsessive compulsive traits that might actually be better understood as something like obsessive compulsive personality disorder, where they have this kind of similar to the just right OCD, except the thoughts aren't ego dystonic. They really think that things should be this way, and they want other people to behave this way, and they're frustrated because the world isn't doing what they want. And so it might look the same, or they're evening things up and making things clean, et cetera, but their motivations are totally different than that of a person with OCD. And I think that that's very dangerous to portray someone with obsessive compulsive personality disorder as having OCD, because it could just be very confusing. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. Every once in a while, usually when I see it done right, it's like one scene from a supporting character in some show I'm watching. And I'm like, oh, they got it right once, and that's always pretty cool. But if they're going to carry through a whole movie, there's maybe only a few films I've seen where it's like, I think they were really thoughtful about this. They really kind of studied the condition. But I don't think that's unique to OCD. I think that's probably true of most mental health conditions.
Yeah, I think the small parts that we keep getting right, maybe we'll keep getting better at getting it right. I hope so.
We also talked in another episode with Dr. Fox about BPD portrayal in the media, which was fascinating because, as we all know, like BPD has been horribly portrayed in film and in TV. And so his take on it and kind of some of his examples were really interesting, because that is such a big one that is often and also can be confused for bipolar and a whole other topic. But it was very interesting to hear his take on it as well.
Well, yeah, it'd be
Yeah.
so damaging because it keeps people from feeling safe enough to ask for help. Like you might. I mean, this isn't a talk about BPD, but it's got 9 criteria, and you need 5 of them to meet the
Yeah.
diagnosis. So it means like you could not have 4 of them, and if any of them are being portrayed as some sort of intolerable thing, and you're like, that's what BPD is. Well, I couldn't possibly have that
Yeah.
because I don't relate to that. It's going to keep you from getting the help that you need.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of people, get their information from this fictional world. And so, there is some responsibility there, I think.
Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting-edge, evidence-based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strassel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com.
So back to talking about, I want to talk about cognitive distortions when it comes to OCD and how someone might begin to challenge those.
So it's not hard to understand how to treat OCD if you understand what really drives it, right? So the goal is to be able to identify and resist compulsions so that you stop sending the signal to your brain that this intrusive thought is a big deal, that can't be tolerated, that's awful. We want to be sending the signal back to the algorithm that it's fine, it's junk mail, you get junk mail in your inbox sometimes, and don't send me more, right? If you're opening it and replying to it, you're telling the algorithm, please send me more, this is important. So on the first session, people walk out of my office thinking like, great, I'm gonna stop doing compulsions and then I'll get better. But then of course they go home and they do compulsions, and you think, well, why? And the reason is, when they get triggered in the moment, they're not thinking, well, I could do my compulsion or I could resist it. In the moment, they're thinking, I have to do this. My life, the lives of others, the polarity of the earth depend on me doing this. And so they're not thinking of it as a voluntary action. And why would that be? If you understand what compulsions are, that you are compelled to do them, you know that they are voluntary. And yet in the moment, it doesn't feel that way. So the reason why that's happening is you're thinking about your experience in a specific way with a certain tone. And that tone or way of thinking is what we're calling cognitive distortions. So distorted ways of engaging with cognition. And everybody who has ever lived and will ever live engages in cognitive distortions, right? Nobody has this like perfect way of thinking. And so we do things like catastrophize, meaning we assume we can predict the future and that it's terrible and we can't cope with it and we get very upset, right? We do divide the world into all or nothing, black and white categories because it's convenient and because that's how products are marketed to us. Like, so we're used to that, but that's not actually how the world works. And we forget that, right? The world works on a spectrum. We do magnify things and discount the positive and rely too heavily on our emotions for proof of things. I feel guilty, therefore I must have done something bad. That's called emotional reasoning. So people with OCD kind of tend towards a subset of these cognitive distortions that just make it feel impossible for them to resist compulsion. So one of the best ways to combat that is to actually learn the names of these distortions and their definitions so that you can catch them. Because in the moment, just calling it out does a lot of the heavy lifting. So if I'm thinking, this interview is going to go so badly, everybody's going to hate it, and they're going to hate me, it's going to ruin my career, and then I'm going to die alone under a bridge. And then I'm like, okay, John, you're catastrophizing. Like immediately, I've become aware that I'm thinking. I've become aware that there's a tone of the thinking that's unhelpful. I'm back in the present moment, observing what's going on. So I'm in a much more advantageous situation for taking care of myself than if I'm just lost in that story. Sometimes when we're doing the work, we might push it even further and not just call out the distortions, but actually try to change the thinking around them. So it might be adding something like, I can't predict the future. I don't know what will happen, but it's probably in my best interest to focus on this interview right here and now than to worry about that, right? You have to be careful with OCD because some forms of cognitive therapy that work on changing the way we think about things can veer a little too close into reassurance territory. And once you start trying to convince yourself that your fears are probably not true, you're now engaging in a debate with the OCD. Well, like, how true are they? And that's when the rumination kicks in. And the thing is, you can't win an argument with OCD because it doesn't care about winning the argument. It just wants to argue. So it'll go on forever if you let it. So when doing cognitive therapy, when working with cognitive distortions in OCD, it's very much like, can you notice it? Can you notice that tone of thinking? Can you label it? Or is there a minor adjustment you want to make? And then get back to what you're doing before you became distracted. And I think of this as mostly a mindfulness issue because what we're saying is, if you could be aware that you are thinking, you could also be aware that there's a tone to the thinking. And that tone would be the cognitive distortion. So developing mindfulness skills is the best way to actually develop cognitive skills, which is that you're starting from this position of being aware that you are thinking, as opposed to just being inside the story.
Well, this has transitioned beautifully because I was going to ask, why is mindfulness such a powerful tool for OCD?
Yeah, I've been interviewed before. I'm kidding. It does always kind of veer into this territory because what are we talking about? We're talking about objects of attention, thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and how they carry us away into these stories. And we don't know it until we're really, really upset. And the goal is to actually maintain a level of awareness. Your mind's going to wander off. That's what minds do. Can you notice that it's wandered off and begin again? So mindfulness just means paying attention to the present moment exactly the way it is, without judgment, without trying to change it. In treatment for OCD using mindfulness, we also think about attentional control. So part of the issue is you're minding your own business and then you get distracted and then you start to think about that distraction. And in the moment that you become aware, you want to come back. But if you have OCD, it's almost like you've signed a contract with the OCD that says you must do something first and then you can come back. You must get reassurance that this fear is untrue, and then you can go back to enjoying your meal or your conversation or whatever you're doing. So mindfulness practice can actually help you regain some of that attentional control by teaching yourself how to notice when you've wandered off and how to return to the present without that precondition, which can be quite scary if you have OCD. I mean, it is a kind of exposure therapy to what happens when you don't take your thoughts so seriously, but you just treat them like things that came up and things that fall down.
In your book, you have a chapter about acceptance, assessment, and action. Can you talk about a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so that's a different, just another way of talking about kind of the three core elements of treating OCD that are discussed in the book. So acceptance is really where you want to begin and end, and that's a reference to mindfulness, right? Things are what they are. They're not the stories about what they are. So there's a difference between a story in your head and an experience. Experience is your five senses and the fact that you have thoughts. But a story is, oh my gosh, I'm a terrible person and these thoughts are going to ruin my life, right? That's not the same thing as experience. So we want to start by accepting that, you are a person who has thoughts, images, and urges, and that's what's happening. If you can end there, that's great. But a lot of people have difficulty with that. So they might start with like, okay, I'm having these thoughts, but it's just terrible. I shouldn't have these thoughts. Something is wrong with me. Okay, so now let's take a little closer look and switch from acceptance to assessment. And this is where we get into cognitive therapy. Let's assess how we're relating to these thoughts and whether it's advisable to keep relating to them that way. So like I just said, I shouldn't have these thoughts. So one of the cognitive distortions is should and must statements. That should immediately make us skeptical when we notice that word should come up a lot. So let's assess. Does that make sense when I say I should never have these thoughts, right? It would be beneficial to have a brain that's incapable of thinking certain things. So that doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. So we might quickly assess, am I catastrophizing? Is this being black and white? And then go back to acceptance. That like, what happened is I got triggered, I didn't like it, I can handle it, now I can move forward. The real meat and potatoes of treating OCD is changing your behavior. It's changing the way that you respond to these thoughts, images, and urges so that you're sending the signal to your brain that this is something that you can handle, that is tolerable, that is not a threat. And the best way we know to do that is something called exposure and response prevention. So acceptance is mindfulness, assessment is cognitive therapy, and then action is the behavioral therapy. So we move into action by saying, okay, my OCD is telling me that I have to go back and wash my hands because I had a thought that maybe I didn't wash them well enough and I might have, bumped into something on my way back from the bathroom and I got to go back and it's got to be perfect. And okay, so I've assessed that this is probably black and white thinking or catastrophizing, but I still can't sit with this feeling, So I know if I go back and wash, it's going to send the signal to my brain that being uncertain about how clean my hands are is like a terrible problem. And I don't want that. I don't want to live that way. So what I'm going to do is choose behaviors that violate that. So I'm going to go and do things with these hands that might be dirty and I don't really know, that I would normally only do with clean hands. I'm going to go make my bed or something like that. And so that's just a very light form of exposure and response prevention. And so that's the action. Sometimes we have to push back because our preconditioning and our tendencies make it very likely that once we get on the hook with the OCD, we're going to keep repeating behaviors that are unhealthy or unhelpful. And we might need to more actively turn that around with exposure and response prevention.
I feel like in almost every interview and conversation we have, it always comes back around to exposure. We did a big one on anxiety, and Cassie and I were getting anxious listening to how much exposure therapy how powerful it is for treating some anxiety, and how a lot of what you think is helpful ends up being avoidance. So it's not really exposure. So just to say that we understand the value of exposure, especially when it comes to thoughts and fears. And staying in line with our conversation, like more a solutions focused part of the conversation, in your book, you use a mnemonic device, always do something courageous and vulnerable. Can you talk about what that is and how it applies to OCD?
Yeah, let me put that in context first. So we're just talking about exposure and response prevention. And let me just say too about exposure that it gets a bad rep because when you think of it, you think of all these like terrible things that nobody wants to do that are really horrifying. But the truth is, anything that you do in response to an unwanted thought that isn't a compulsion and isn't some certainty-seeking mission, if you have OCD, you know that that's an exposure, right? So it's not just touching dirty things or watching scary movies. It is also dropping your stories and being mindful and choosing to engage with your values. So we have all these different sort of modalities, and some of them will say that they're different from exposure. But if you have OCD, if they're asking you to do anything other than compulsions, they're asking you to do exposure. It just might not be this very kind of overt top-down exposure. It's very scary not to do compulsions. So to your specific question about always do something courageous and vulnerable, there's two main things that we hope will happen when we do ERP. One is called habituation, which is this experience of the fear being habituated to, meaning you're less distressed by it because you repeatedly engage with it and then nothing happens. And then at some point you realize it doesn't scare you anymore. And this is great when this happens, but when in treatment, we don't want to make anxiety or any kind of distress the enemy, because we have to be able to feel these experiences. They can be very unpleasant and they're just part of life. So if we're only focusing on anxiety going down, we might be missing the fact that, you know, life is kind of scary and gross, and like we have to be able to deal with these feelings from time to time. So there's another thing that kind of takes place in exposure and response prevention called inhibitory learning. And the idea behind inhibitory learning is that your brain has paired this trigger with something called intolerable fear. And by having multiple experiences with the trigger that are different from the intolerable fear, that are just more tolerable, that are more like a safety signal than a danger signal, those new associations compete with the old association and inhibit you from going to that place of intolerable fear. So a good metaphor for this is, if you like watching horror movies, you go into the movie theater thinking, oh, I hope this is really boring. No, of course not. You go into it thinking like, oh, I hope this like just, you know, really damages my mental health. Like, I'm excited about this. And then something terrible happens in the movie and you're like, this is terrible. And if I catch you in that moment, you're not having a good time, right? Everything in your body is saying, we're under attack, something is bad. And then as we move forward, your body relaxes, you know, like you turn to your friend, you're like, that was messed up. You grab some popcorn, you go back to watching the movie. And at no point in that relationship with the fear did it occur to you, I have to get out of this theater. I have to run away from this. You were completely open to the experience. You were inhibited from running away because you've seen many different scary movies in many different places, you know, in the movie theater, at home on TV, with different people. And so you've kind of learned over time to be inhibited from relating to that fear state like it's something you have to get away from. So how do we make it the most likely that that will happen when we're doing exposure and response prevention? This is a very long-winded way of getting around to your question. The mnemonic, always do something courageous and vulnerable, stands for 5 concepts in exposure and response prevention that we think are likely to produce this inhibitory learning. One is anxiety tolerance, as opposed to like engaging with the anxiety and hoping it goes down, actually engaging with the anxiety and letting it be, and really opening up to having the experience of anxiety. So that's the A. The D is disconfirming expectations. So you don't know how this exposure is going to go. It's really scary for you. You suspect you're probably not in any real life danger because no therapist would put you in any real life danger, but you don't know if you're going to be able to handle this or not. And your expectation is it's going to be a 10 out of 10. It turns out it was a 7 out of 10, right? So your expectation was disconfirmed. The S stands for surprise. So it's actually really beneficial. The more surprised you are, like, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought, or that was really bad, but I handled it better than I thought, the more likely you're going to remember that the next time you get triggered. Now I'm doing it in my head, always do something courageous, right? So the C is combining fear cues. So that means trying to approach the exposure with as much of the experience as possible. So let's say you're afraid of these intrusive thoughts of snapping, or doing something violent in front of somebody. So what are the cues for that? So one is the intrusive thoughts. Okay, so let's be in front of someone and choose to have the thoughts. What other cues are there? Well, there's visual cues, like maybe holding a knife. Okay, so we'll hold a knife. What about sensory cues? Well, if I'm feeling like tense or sweaty, that might make it worse. So maybe we'll run in place for a little bit before we do the exposure. So we're combining the fear cues just to maximize the experience. And then the last one, the V, is for variety. So not just doing in vivo exposures and imaginal exposures and interoceptive exposures, but also doing them in different contexts, in different places, so that it generalizes. So that you're not overcoming your fear of the doorknob in my office, but you're overcoming your fear of things that are touched by other people.
Well, thank you for that response. It was all encompassing, and I think it did a really good job. And I don't think I'll forget always do something courageous and vulnerable now, at least. So we've done a good job at setting the stage and explaining what obsessive compulsive disorder is, what it isn't. We've talked about a few of the different solution-based methods that are used in practice. And I wanted to go back and say to anyone listening, what would your advice be about when it would be time to seek help or to seek a therapist for feelings of maybe that someone might feel that they identify with some of the traits we've talked about today?
Um, it's never too late to ask for help, but it's also never too early to ask for help. And so some of it's going to depend on the culture that you come from and the relationship, that meaning the culture of your family or the culture of where you're from, and the relationship that you have just with mental health systems in general. You might have varying reasons for not trusting the mental health system. And so that might make you feel like it's important to wait or to be very, careful in selecting the right treatment provider. Or you might come from a system where you and everybody you know is already in therapy and is like, yes, I'm going to therapy now too. So everybody's different in this regard. I think that at the end of the day, it's not about how much do you wash your hands or like how uh, taboo are your thoughts or how many thoughts are you having. It's about your subjective assessment of your level of suffering, right? Life can be very painful, but pain is something that we can tolerate. But suffering is that story that we add to the pain that just can make life seem just unbearable or unreasonably unfair. And only you know what your level of suffering is, but you can kind of have a sense of like, all right, that's enough suffering for me. I'm ready to go ask for help. That's why I love what I do. I don't think of myself so much as an OCD therapist or a cognitive behavioral therapist, or I just think of myself as being in the business of reducing suffering. And it's just that the language that I'm most comfortable with and where I have the most experience is in this OCD realm. So those are the people that I help. Um, but yeah, it's never too late or too early to ask for help. And back to that discussion earlier about stigma, um, it's not just how we see it on TV or how we feel about ourselves, but it's also within the mental health treatment community. I mean, there are providers who have stigma against different things that they don't want to treat, or they think it's too hard to treat, or they don't want to learn about. And I think in general it's getting better, but it's still part of a process. We're all still growing.
Yeah, that's important to know. And, we work in mental health, Kendall and I, and, a lot of our friends talk about therapy. And I always remind my friends who are sort of starting to look for therapists that you may not find the right fit the first time around. Like, I think that's also really important to note that just because one relationship with a therapist didn't work out doesn't mean, you can't ever seek therapy again. So I think that's important to keep in mind in the conversation. And as we start to wrap up, we talked about it a little earlier, but I'd love to hear from you about why it's so important for people to share their stories of OCD.
I think it can be super helpful. I don't want to call it important in the sense of, gee, you really have to do it if you don't want to, because there's nothing more personal than your relationship with your worst thoughts, right? But I do find a lot of people with OCD really benefit from participating in, discussion boards and support groups and things like that, especially later in their treatment journey when they can articulate what it's like to get better. Because not only does that feel good to sort of pay it forward and help other people, but it also helps concretize the learning, right? So being able to talk about OCD from the perspective of knowing how to treat it, it's it's like anything else you might learn, and then sort of like repeating it back. This is how we're supposed to learn in school. We have to be able to tell the teacher that we know what they're talking about. So I think one part of it is just it's good practice to keep articulating to others how we're supposed to deal with unwanted thoughts and how we're supposed to take care of our mental health. It's not just for them, but to keep it fresh for us. And then, of course, if you can put any good into this messy world, you might as well. And so that's like one way to do it is just throw something out there that might make somebody else feel less alone. I think that's a good way to spend your time.
It also sounds like you said when you get to a point where you feel comfortable doing that in whatever capacity it is, it feels a little cathartic or a little bit exposure therapy adjacent, kind of facing your fears of sharing your some of those like deep thoughts that you've had that are sometimes uncomfortable. And as we wrap up, did you have any final thoughts or anything you wanted to say before we finished?
Well, actually, you just made me think about it. The other part of sharing your story with others is that validation component, right? When other people react with, "Oh, I have that too," or "Oh, I know someone who has that too," or "Wow, no one's ever put it that way before." Um, that's a very powerful experience, and I think that's we were talking before about OCD being so isolating for people. Sometimes it's because um, part of the disorder is thinking that you're alone, right? That you're the one having the wrong thoughts, doing the wrong things. And like, there might be other people out there with OCD, but their OCD is treatable and mine isn't because I'm special and unique and more of a problem. And being able to engage with others who have OCD and see that, like, maybe they're not having the same symptoms, but they're speaking the same language. That validation goes a long way.
Well, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Jon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
If you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you might have an irrational fear of being contaminated by germs or obsessively double check things. You may even feel like a prisoner, trapped with your intrusive thoughts. And while OCD can have a devastating impact on your life, getting real help can be a challenge. Combining mindfulness practices with cognitive behavioral therapy, the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD offers practical and accessible tools for managing the unwanted thoughts and compulsive urges that are associated with OCD. With this workbook, you will develop present moment awareness, learn to challenge your own distorted thinking, and stop treating thoughts as threats and feelings as facts. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
Help your clients achieve lasting emotional balance with the DBT Skills Mega Bundle from New Harbinger Publications. This essential collection offers everything you need to effectively deliver dialectical behavior therapy in your practice, including a set of 8 exclusive microskills videos to help improve client motivation and treatment. Visit newharbinger.com for more information.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.